problem. So I think with that, let me continue. Hope I answered some of that.
What was that?
Commonlawvenue.com. Mm-hmm.
I went to that website.
Mm-hmm.
They sent to another website. I got screwed up with that.
Well, you will get confused when you go to the website because it's so large. You go into the common law library under that website, and you can actually spend a week there. They've been in. You've been there?
Well, no, but I've been on.
Yeah. Now, what this is my passport. Now, my passport is different than most people's passport. I cannot buy a cover for this passport because it's bigger than everybody else's. So I do it without a cover. My passport number is engraved across the top. What they did is take a bunch of little holes, drills, and they drilled holes, and that's my passport number. And if you could see it where they drilled it, it would be there. My passport does not have an address on it. It has my name, and it says I'm retired. But I live right here, right? I reside sometimes in Henderson because sometimes I live there at night longer than I live here. Yeah. I cannot buy a cover for this passport because it's bigger. What they'll do is, countries honor it. We have, I don't see them, but they have a stamp that they'll put inside, and all the countries. See, this guy here, whenever we was down in Portugal or down there fighting and so forth in South America, this guy was down there, David. And whenever David was down there, and now that he's in Washington, he knows everybody in Washington. And I told him about my Israel, ambassador of Israel, 144,000 people under me, and diplomat and all that stuff. He said, well, Harry, why don't I let you just talk to him? I says, okay. So I did talk to him, and we agreed that as soon as they quit fighting with the United States and Israel, there's a little bit of a conflict there. They said they'll go ahead and send you your diplomatic papers so you can get your plates. But I don't want their plates now. I'm higher than they are there as a diplomat from Israel. But he knows.
Trouble getting back into the United States.
No, and if we did have a problem, his phone number's on the bottom, and I would just hand this to the fellow and please call David, and he'll tell you who I am, and they'll let me right in the state. But this is done in 7 different languages, and if you want a visa, you go get a visa, and they'll put it right on here. And every time you do that, you tell you tell David that you did that, and he'll put it in your records. And every time you tell him something, it just makes you stronger. And then once you have 6 or 7 different countries in here, and a little policeman stops you, and you just tell the policeman, well, here's my driver's license. You don't recognize this in Henderson, but by the Hague Act, 183 different countries recognize it. It's odd that you don't recognize it, because I can travel throughout the world with this passport.
What if you want to go to a country where you live more than 6 months of the year?
Yeah, I would just tell him that I would want, he'll get me a visa, and I would want a visa, and he'll say, send your passport to Israel or wherever, Germany, and they'll stamp it, and then you'll come back and you'll have it. Yeah. Well, if they let you in the country, I mean, right now they probably wouldn't let me in China, maybe. I don't know. See, whenever I did my apostille, you have to understand, the apostille works this way. It lets me go any place in the United States. Where when I was doing this, I said, well, I'm going to tell this policeman that I'm a diplomat within my own country. Well, that creates a problem because I'm not in the United States corporate thing no more. And what makes that judge recognize my country? Because he don't have to. So I could be put in jail or something because he won't recognize my country. So I asked him at the Secretary of State's office, I said, you give me a apostille, and I can use that in the people that's in the Hague Act. But what happens, I lied a little bit. I said, well, I sell Bell & Howell cameras, and I travel all over the country, and I travel through China, and my apostille is no good in China. He said, well, for $15, we'll do a certification. I said, what's that? He said, now you can use any place in the world. So I had that done. That means if it's good any place in the world, it covers the places the apostille don't cover. My little country that I live in, being as good any place in the world, the judge has to recognize my country, which they'll recognize anyhow. I don't have a problem with it, but that's how it works.
Are you considered a diplomat if you go to Canada?
Yeah. A diplomat from China is still a diplomat no matter where he goes.
So you're a diplomat from the United States of America.
Yeah, and this is an American passport. It's not a corporate United States passport. It's an American passport.
Where do you get your visas from? You get them from the corporate?
I get it from Mr. David, and David is on my identification card, and I'll show you in just a minute. On this is a World Service
Tonight we have a special guest. So I hope you guys.
He's got a
I
name
think I
tag.
said a special guest, not a special pet.
What does it say? Newsletter editor, Founders District Toastmasters International.
Okay.
Toastmasters, right on.
Yes. So this is Howard Hinman, and he's going to talk about trusts. Okay.
Cool. Take it away.
All right.
And as soon as you start recording, I'll start. Feel free to record.
You recording?
Are you recording?
Chuck's doing it with his phone. I hope that works.
Presiding officers, ladies and gentlemen, in this talk, I shall accomplish the following. I will share with you information about the common law local trust, also known as the private trust. One of the secrets of North America's wealthiest families. You'll know their names when I tell them. This is part of a larger series which will be available on Bright Star from my trust, Charles Arthur Enterprises Trust of Santa Monica. Thank you for having me here. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks to David, thanks to Jackie, and John. It's great to see you again. It's been far too many years.
Oh, you're that old, John?
What I'm going to talk about is an interface between your world and the commercial world. Because essentially, trusts give divided title properly done. You have a situation where you have the legal owners, the trustees, and the equitable owners. And therefore, this is part of a four-star series in association with a firm called Brilliance in Commerce. They're out of Honolulu, or actually out of Washington and Hawaii. And I'll be doing this again later on in the year, again through the Bright Star organization, which has people like Deepak Chopra and others of that ilk. So the first type, or this is fundamentals of trust operation, your foundation. The next three presentations, and we'll go for, these presentations will be 20-25 minutes, and I'll entertain 15-20 minutes of question and answers, and I have a wrap-up. Is fundamentals of trust operation personnel, fundamentals of trust operation resources. Personnel, procedures, and resources. Then I'll talk about the situation of most Americans. Rags to riches to rags in 3 generations or less. Talk about the or less. I'll talk about the dangers of the statutory trust. First, of course, the appropriate disclaimer. I am a paralegal, not an attorney. I'm not a member of any bar I cannot belly up to. And nothing in this talk is construed as either legal, tax, or financial advice, and everything in this talk is construed as legal and financial education. I also may throw in a magic fairy, and if you have a common law irrevocable trust, as if a good fairy, because I only allow good fairies in my talk, has waved a magic wand over yourself and your family and giving the gift of what? Perpetual wealth. If you excuse me, I have a quote I'm going to give at some point. Let me go back and grab it. You want to quote this down exactly when it comes to time? I think it was sweet. It's important. When you're quoting the tax authorities, you want exactly quote them. This will be from our website. Website for Charles Arthur Enterprises, www.passingbucks.com. From our books, The Art of Passing the Buck, Volume 1, and the Art of Passing the Buck, Volume 2. We also
Just how is money created? Well, there was a time when producing money meant mining a metal like gold, getting dirty and sweaty. Indeed, one of my favorite movies of all times is Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which focuses a lot of attention on exactly how gold is mined. But the process evolved until today. It is true that money is created out of thin air by the central banks of the world, including our own United States Federal Reserve. While it is true that the United States owns gold and stores that gold in Fort Knox, we will see that the gold at Fort Knox is no closer to money in the United States than the oil in our Strategic Petroleum Reserve. One important point to keep in mind as we study the period of history in which money was backed by gold is that gold discoveries are random events, just like in Treasure of the Sierra Madres. After all, Columbus came to the New World hoping to find gold, as did many Europeans who followed him. And it would be surprising if a gold discovery that significantly increased the world's supply of gold had no disruptive effect when money was backed by gold. Nevertheless, there are today public figures who believe that the United States should and eventually will return to the gold standard. The U.S. could return to the gold standard within 5 years, according to magazine publisher Steve Forbes. The former GOP presidential candidate told a conservative newspaper, Human Events, that a gold standard would stabilize the dollar and restore confidence in the U.S. Treasury bonds among foreign investors. If the dollar was as good as gold, other countries would want to buy it, Forbes said. Steve Forbes is not alone in his view. Texas Congressman Ron Paul suggests that our Federal Reserve System, where someone can, quote, push a button and create new money, is flawed, and that a return to the gold standard would be preferred. By the end of this lecture, you will have a better understanding of the costs and benefits of our money creation system. You will have a better idea of the costs and benefits of returning to the gold standard. Now, why is this important? As I've said before, money is an invention as important to the development of mankind as was the wheel. Without money, there would be very little trade. Without trade, according to Adam Smith, there would be very little specialization. And specialization is, according to Smith, the source of the wealth of nations. So it makes sense, both in the context of this course and in the context of our citizenship, ask whether we have the right system in place to manage the creation of money. Today we will learn how paper money was created during the era when money was primarily gold and other precious metals or backed by gold and other precious metals. We'll see how the gold standard, an arrangement where governments agreed to peg the value of their paper money to gold, and I'll explain what peg means, how that system worked and why it ended. Now, in thinking about the creation of money, it's helpful to use T accounts. And these T accounts are called T accounts because they have the shape of the capital letter T. So, what's a T account? A T account is a graphical representation of the balance sheet of an economic entity, a household, a bank, whatever. The T account lists assets on the left side and liabilities on the right-hand side. It also lists the entity's net worth on the right-hand side. Now, by definition, a balance sheet must balance, and to accomplish balance, net worth is always defined as the value of assets minus the value of liabilities. Let's do an example in order to make sure that this is well understood. So, Joe has just graduated from college and is taking stock of his life. Joe owns an automobile worth $4,000, has $200 in his checking account, and $500 in his savings account. Now, Joe went to state college and graduated with no student loan debt. Lucky Joe. But he does have some liabilities. He currently has a $750 balance on his only credit card. The T account you're looking at depicts Joe's assets, Joe's liabilities, and Joe's net worth. Under the assets, auto $4,000, checking account $200, savings account $500. Under the liabilities, credit card debt $750, and his net worth $4,700 in assets minus $750 in credit card debt. His liability, his net worth $3,950. Recall that an early example of the creation of paper money revolves around London goldsmiths. The earliest uses of paper money in Western civilization were warehouse receipts for gold. Now, goldsmiths had good safes, and it became customary for their customers to leave gold for safekeeping with the goldsmiths. In return for depositing their gold with the goldsmith would issue receipts to their customers. Customers learned that it was more convenient and safe to buy and sell goods using the receipts themselves than returning the goldsmith and reclaiming the gold. Voila! The warehouse receipts for gold became paper money backed by gold deposits. Okay? How could we use a T account to explain the creation of paper money by a London goldsmith? Because indeed, that happened. All right, let's do an example. Let's imagine a goldsmith who has initially gold holdings of 1,000 pounds, and by that I mean not weight, but 100 pounds sterling. And in exchange, the goldsmith has issued 1,000 pounds sterling of warehouse receipts. Assets of 1,000, liabilities of 1,000, net worth of 0. Now, in a minute, we're going to have our goldsmith make a change. But what's that change based on? Well, Goldsmith, and ours in particular, quickly realized that on any given day, they held more gold in their safes, their vaults, their safekeeping places, than they needed, either for their own work or to satisfy whichever customers wanted to reclaim the gold and represent their receipts. Goldsmiths were a clever folk, and they quickly concluded that they had a great opportunity. They could create new warehouse receipts without more gold, and they could lend those warehouse receipts to additional depository customers. So, let's return to our T account. After making such a loan, the balance sheet of our goldsmith would look something like the following. Now, under the assets, the goldsmith would have 1,000 pounds sterling worth of gold and a second asset, a loan of 1,000 pounds. What would the goldsmith have as liabilities? 2,000 pounds sterling of warehouse receipts. Net worth would still be 0. Well, you're curious. Why would the goldsmith create new warehouse receipts if doing so didn't increase net worth? When the borrower paid off the loan, the borrower would pay back principal, what was borrowed, plus interest. At that point, the net worth of the goldsmith would increase. Now, if the goldsmith had used modern accounting rules, net worth would increase at the time of the loan because it would reflect anticipation of the future interest payments. But that's not important to our story. These gold warehouse receipts are an example of a gold-backed paper currency. The warehouse receipts circulated as money as long as the Goldsmith Bank continued to redeem the receipts for gold whenever customers demanded gold. Each Goldsmith Bank held its own gold reserves. So think about that for a minute. Each Goldsmith Bank had created new receipts, and yet the system would continue to function, provided the Goldsmith Bank was never called upon to repay more gold than they were able to repay. Now, banks continued to make loans with paper backed by gold well into the 19th century in the United States. Each individual bank held its own warehouse receipts and issued its own currency. That is, each individual bank had its own store of gold and created their own kinds of currencies. Keep in mind that those banks and those currencies could fail and often did. So recall in our first lecture that our Kansas homesteader was legitimately worried about whether those notes from a bank in Illinois would continue to be honored. While this is a valid early stage in the gold standard, it is not what most economists mean by the gold standard, as we shall now see. The gold standard, as occurred in most of the 20th century in the United States, was an agreement upon participating countries to fix the price of each country's currency in terms of an ounce of gold. To understand the origins of this version of the gold standard, the modern version, we have to again inquire about England, because England officially adopted the gold standard in 1819. Although, truth be told, the English mint had been fixing the value of the pound sterling in terms of gold since much earlier, 1717. The United States adopted the gold standard in 1834 when it fixed the price of gold at $20.67 per ounce and kept it there until 1933. Under the gold standard, the government promises to buy and sell gold in exchange for its currency in order to keep the currency price of the gold at the promised value. So the gold standard is a promise. If the promise is credible, that is, if the government's actions are as good as its word, then the national currency is as good as gold. And banks will hold that national currency in reserve. The following balance sheets for an English bank and for the Bank of England explain how the gold standard worked. Keep in mind now, we are looking for a transition here. We're looking to understand how the modern gold standard, where the Bank of England promised to buy and sell gold at a fixed price, is different from the original gold standard when each bank held its own deposits of gold. So let's use this tool that we've taken the trouble to learn about in order to understand how the gold standard worked. What about the typical English bank? What did its balance sheet look like? Well, its assets included currency, pound notes, and loans. Other things as well, but most importantly, currency and loans, promises to repay by the bank's customers. What about its liabilities? Deposits with the bank. Okay? Notice there's no gold there. What about the balance sheet of the Bank of England? What did it look like? Well, its assets included gold and any loans it had made to banks. And its liabilities had predominantly one item: pound notes. the currency of England. The typical English bank operated under the gold standard in much the same way as it did when it held its own deposits of gold. The bank held, instead of gold itself, British pound notes in reserve so that depositors could convert their deposits to pounds whenever they wished. The customers, that is the depositors, rightly thought of their deposits as equivalent to pound notes and therefore as good as gold, since the bank stood ready to redeem them for currency whenever the customers wanted. The banks used their extra or excess reserves to make new loans, like the goldsmith did, by creating new deposit accounts for borrowers. Now, what is this term excess reserves? Well, the bank reckoned its extra or excess reserves to be reserves beyond the amount required by law or by prudent behavior. Sometimes banks would hold no more than the legally required amount of reserves. They'd loan every sou they could. But sometimes banks found it prudent to hold more reserves than required by law. In that regard, the banks were behaving a lot like the goldsmiths would behave, right? It was important to be able to redeem a depositor's demand for gold when the depositor made it. Today, banks want to make sure that they can give currency back for their deposits when a customer, a depositor, wishes. So in that regard, the bank's behavior isn't very much different. The real difference between the gold standard and earlier times when each bank held its own gold reserves centers on the role and the behavior of the Bank of England. The Bank of England is the central bank of the British system. It's the equivalent of our Federal Reserve, although it's very much older, and we'll talk about that. Under the gold standard, the Bank of England held the gold that backed the British pound. Remember the balance sheet. Did this fix the money supply? You bet. The gold holdings of the Bank of England placed an upper limit on the supply of British pound notes. They limited the amount of currency. How did the gold standard work? How did the Bank of England fulfill its promise to peg the price of gold in terms of its currency? How did the Bank of England behave so that the pound remained as good as gold? It did the following. If the value of the pound began to fall in terms of gold, how would we know that? Well, if the price of gold began to rise in terms of the number of pounds it took to buy an ounce, then the Bank of England would do one very simple thing. It would raise the interest rate it charged on loans to banks. And that would raise interest rates in England. What would happen? So what? Oh, but people are selfish. If England's paying higher interest rates, gold would flow into England in order to take advantage of those higher rates. Gold holders would want to deposit their gold in England, where interest rates were now higher. What would that do? Well, that would make gold more plentiful in England. The price of gold, therefore, would fall, and the price of the pound, in terms of gold, would rise back toward the promised level. Let's do the opposite case. Suppose the value of the pound began to rise in terms of gold, so the pound price of gold began to fall. The Bank of England would then lower interest rates, and gold would flood away from England. That's called a gold outflow. The gold would leave England, headed for other countries where interest rates would higher. And the gold outflow would make gold less plentiful in England and make the price of gold rise in England and the price of the pound in terms of gold fall. Okay. We come now to the transition from the gold standard to the current system of monetary creation. Please recall, then under our current system, it is the law of the land that currency is a valid form of payment for all debts. We said earlier that paper money issued by England, by the United States, by the Eurozone, is valuable by fiat, by government declaration. Let's return to our T accounts one additional time to see what that means. For the individual bank, the T account is unchanged because each bank continues to hold the national currency, the national money in reserve for deposits. The difference is that after fiat money is established and the gold standard ends, the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve no longer fixes the price of gold in terms of the British pound or the US dollar. Therefore, it no longer has to increase gold reserves to levels sufficient to make credible its promise to buy pounds with gold. The Bank of England, the Central Bank of the European Union, or the Federal Reserve are now free to create currency by making loans of currency to banks without having the additional gold necessary to make an exchange of those dollars or pounds or euros for gold. Banks in England that receive the increases in currency are in free turn to create new deposits for their customers. And there were and continue to be no limits to the creation of money beyond the self-imposed limits set by the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve as it fulfills its responsibility to its people. Why did the world leave the gold standard? The Bank of England and most other combatants left the gold standard temporarily during World War I and World War II because it wanted to finance British war expenditures and U.S. war expenditures and French war expenditures by issuing new currency. The British Treasury, for example, created war bonds. It sold those bonds in the open marketplace and used the proceeds to finance wartime expenditures. But the Bank of England issued new British pounds to buy some of those bonds so that the interest rate on those bonds wouldn't rise too high. After World War II, under the so-called Bretton Woods system, the U.S. fixed the price of the gold at $35 per ounce. Other nations held the dollar as reserve. So this was our last return to the gold standard. What happened is that the U.S. pegged the price of gold at $35 an ounce. And the U.S.'s promise was grounds elsewhere in the world for central banks to hold the dollar as if it was gold. Notice that now not every central bank is holding its own gold reserve. Everybody's counting on the United States to make the dollar as good as gold, and therefore are holding dollars as if they were gold. Led by the United States, the world finally left the gold standard on August 15, 1971, when President Nixon announced that the United States would no longer redeem U.S. dollars for gold. The U.S. left the gold standard because the gold standard placed very tight restrictions on the U.S. ability to increase the supply of paper money. So what, you ask? Well, these restrictions were incompatible with other U.S. policy objectives, not the least of which was financing a new war, the Vietnam conflict. Let's now come back to the challenge posed by those people who believe that the U.S. and the world should return to the gold standard. And let's do what economists always should do and examine the benefits and costs of returning to the gold standard. What would be the benefit of returning to the gold standard? I'll signal one very important one, and that appears to be all. On average, under the gold standard, inflation was lower than it was in periods when central banks could create money without adding to gold reserves. Put another way, under the restriction imposed by the gold standard, under the promise by the central banks to exchange gold for paper money, central banks all over the world issued less paper money, with the result that the average inflation rate was lower, less seigniorage. But there were costs. Under the gold standard, U.S. prices were more volatile than in any other period, including the period since we left the gold standard. In addition, it's expensive to maintain a gold reserve. Milton Friedman famously estimated the expense at being as much as 2.5% of gross national product. Why? Well, it's expensive to maintain that gold reserve. Maybe the most important cost is that under a gold standard, central banks are not free to undertake so-called counter-cyclical policies. Their hands are tied by keeping their promise. They don't have the freedom to raise the money supply to stimulate the economy when that appears to be warranted. Under the gold standard, the nations all fix the values of their currencies to gold. What does that imply? Well, the value of one currency to another is also fixed. It can't adjust to market forces. We all must keep in mind that gold discoveries are random events. And the U.S. accounts for only a small share of gold discoveries. For example, in 2009, the United States produced, how much do you think? Only 9.1% of the world's gold. China produced 13.1%. South Africa produced 8.1%. Russia produced 7.8%. I close this lecture by considering what has happened to the price of gold since the U.S. and the world abandoned the gold standard. The blue line in the diagram you see shows the dollar price of gold. It hit its all-time high in 2010 at over $1,230 per ounce. The red line shows the real price of gold. Now, that's the price of gold in dollars relative to a bushel basket of the typical goods consumed by a household in the United States. So I've defined that real price so that the nominal and real prices are equal in 1983, but that doesn't mean anything. Put another way, that real price of gold is adjusted for inflation, that's all. What do I want you to see here? What would I like you to notice from the graph? The real price of gold has been highly variable. This is not a surprise. World demand and supply for gold varies a lot, and the real price of gold adjusts accordingly to make demand equal supply. If the United States were still on the gold standard, the United States would have been trying to keep the price of gold constant when world market forces dictated that it should have changed a lot. Let me ask you a final question. Are Stephen Forbes and Ron Paul right? Should we return to a world in which new money could be created only if gold reserves were obtained? If gold production grew slowly, would the resulting slow growth in the money supply drag down economic growth in nations that use gold for money? Would the United States be better off entrusting growth of the U.S. money supply to the Federal Reserve than to worldwide demand for and supply of gold, for which the U.S. produces less than 10%? You be the judge.
The Changing World Order. The times ahead will be radically different from those that we've experienced in our lifetimes, though similar to many times before. How do I know that? Because they always have been. Over my roughly 50 years of global macroeconomic investing, I've learned the hard way that the most important events that surprised me did so because they never happened in my lifetime. These painful surprises led me to study the last 500 years of history for similar situations, where I saw that they had indeed happened many times before, with the ups and the downs of the Dutch, British, and U.S. empires. And every time they did, it was a sign of the changing world order. This study taught me valuable lessons that I'm going to pass along to you here in a distilled form. You can find the comprehensive version in my book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Let me begin with a story that brought me to this point, about how I learned to anticipate the future by studying the past. In 1971, when I was a young clerk on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the United States ran out of money and defaulted on its debts. That's right, the U.S. ran out of money. How? Well, back then, gold was the money used in transactions between countries. Paper money, like the dollar, was like checks in a checkbook in that it had no value other than it could be exchanged for gold, which was the real money. At the time, the United States was spending a lot more money than it was earning by writing a lot more of these paper money checks than it had gold in the bank to exchange for them. As people turned these checks into the bank for gold money, the amount of gold in the U.S. started to dwindle. It soon became obvious that the U.S. couldn't keep its promises for all the existing paper money, so people holding dollars rushed to exchange them before the gold ran out. Recognizing that the U.S. was going to run out of real money, on Sunday evening, August 15th, President Nixon went on television to tell the world that the U.S. was breaking its promise to let people exchange their dollars for gold. Of course, he didn't say it that way. He said it more diplomatically, without making it clear that the United States was defaulting.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
I watched in awe, realizing that money as we understood it was ending. What a crisis. I expected the stock market to plunge the next day, so I got on the exchange floor early to prepare. When the opening bell rang, pandemonium broke out, but not the kind I expected. The market was up, way up, and went on to rise nearly 25%. That surprised me because I never experienced a currency devaluation before. When I dug into history, I discovered that the exact same thing happened in 1933 and had the exact same effect. Then, paper dollars were also linked to gold, which the U.S. was running out of because it was spending more paper money checks than it had gold to exchange for them. And President Roosevelt announced on the radio that he would break the country's promise to exchange dollars for gold.
It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the National Bank holiday. And this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric. The second step last Thursday was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible, in view of the requirement of time, to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation.
In both cases, breaking the link to gold allowed the U.S. to continue spending more than it earned, simply by printing more paper dollars. Since there was an increase in the number of dollars without an increase in the country's wealth, the value of each dollar fell. As these new dollars entered the market, without a corresponding increase in productivity, they went to buy lots of stocks, gold, and commodities, and hence caused their prices to rise. As I studied more history, I saw that the exact same thing happened many, many times before. I saw that since the beginning of time, when governments spent much more than they took in taxes, and conditions got bad, they ran out of money and they needed more. So they printed more, a lot more, which made its value fall and made the prices of most everything, including stocks, gold, and commodities, rise. That's when I first learned the principle that when central banks print a lot of money to relieve a crisis, buy stocks, gold, and commodities, because their value will rise and the value of paper money will fall. This printing of money is also what happened in 2008 to relieve the mortgage-driven debt crisis, and in 2020 to relieve the pandemic-driven economic crisis, and it almost certainly will happen in the future. So I suggest that you keep this principle in mind. These experiences gave me another principle, which is to understand what is coming at you, you need to understand what happened before you. That principle led me to study how the Roaring '20s bubble turned into the 1930s depression, which gave me the lessons that allowed me to anticipate and profit from the 2007 bubble turning into the 2008 bust. All these experiences led me to develop an almost instinctual urge to look to the past for similar situations to learn how to handle the future well. Changing orders. Over the last few years, three big things that hadn't happened in my lifetime prompted me to do this study. First, countries didn't have enough money to pay their debts, even after lowering interest rates to zero, so their central banks began printing lots of money to do so. Second, big internal conflicts emerged due to growing gaps in wealth and values. This showed up in political populism and polarization between the left, who want to redistribute wealth, and the right, who want to defend those holding the wealth. And third, increasing external conflict between a rising great power and the leading great power, as is now happening with China and the United States. So I looked back. I saw that all these had happened together before, many times, and nearly always led to changing domestic and world orders. The last time this sequence happened was from 1930 to 1945. What exactly is an order, you might ask? It's a governing system for people dealing with each other. There are internal orders for governing within countries, typically laid out in constitutions. And there is a world order for governing between countries, typically laid out in treaties. Internal orders change at different times than world orders, though whether within or between countries, these orders typically change after wars. Civil wars within countries, international wars between countries. They happen when revolutionary new forces defeat weak old orders. For example, the U.S. internal order was laid out in the Constitution in 1789 after the American Revolution, and it is still operating today, even after the American Civil War. Russia got rid of its old order and established a new one with the Russian Revolution in 1917, which ended in 1991 with a relatively bloodless revolution. China began its current internal order in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War. You get the idea. The current world order, commonly called the American World Order, formed after the Allied victory in World War II, when the U.S. emerged as the dominant world power. It was set out in agreements and treaties for how global governance and monetary systems work. In 1944, the new world monetary system was laid out in the Bretton Woods Agreement and established the dollar as the world's leading reserve currency. A reserve currency is a currency that is commonly accepted around the world, and having one is a key factor in a country becoming the richest and most powerful empire. With a new dominant power and monetary system established, a new world order begins. These changes take place in a timeless and universal cycle that I call the Big Cycle. I'll start with a quick overview, then give you a more complete version, and then direct you to my book if you want more. As I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies, it took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring an empire's power? In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, The big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again. As I looked back, I saw that these cause and effect relationships drove the cycles of rises and declines all the way back to the Roman Empire. I saw how the stories of each one of these cycles blended together with others before, during, and after, in the same way as each individual story blends with others to make the epic 500-year story that is our collective history. And like human life cycles, no two are exactly the same, but most are similar. They're driven by logical cause and effect relationships that progress through stages from birth to strength and maturity to weakness and inevitably decline. However, that's like saying a person's life cycle takes 80 years on average, without recognizing that many are much shorter and many are longer. While age can be a good indicator of future longevity, a better way is to look at health indicators. One can do that with empires and their vital signs too. I found that by watching the indicators of power change, I was able to see what stage a country was in, which helped me to anticipate what was likely to come next. Now, I'll take you through the big cycle in more detail. Give me 20 minutes and I'll give you the last 500 years of history and show you the similar patterns across the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese empires. 500 years of big cycles. I'm going to describe the typical cycle by dividing it into 3 phases: the rise, the top, and the decline. The rise. Successful new orders that rise, both internal and external, are typically started by powerful revolutionary leaders doing 4 things. First, they win power by gaining more support than the opposition. Second, they consolidate power by converting, weakening, or eliminating the opposition so they don't stand in their way. Third, they establish systems and institutions that make the country work well. And fourth, they pick their successors well, or create systems that do that. Because a great empire requires many great leaders over several generations. At this stage, soon after winning the fight, there is typically a period of peace and growing prosperity because the leadership is clearly dominant and has broad support, so no one wants to fight it. During this phase, leaders within the country have to design an excellent system to raise the country's wealth and power. First and foremost, to be great, they must have strong education. which is not just teaching knowledge and skills, but also strong character, civility, and work ethic. These are typically taught in the family, schools, and religious institutions. That provides a healthy respect for rules and laws, order within society, low corruption, and enables them to unite behind a common purpose and work well together. As they do this, they increasingly shift from producing basic products to innovating and inventing new technologies. For example, the Dutch rose to defeat the Habsburg Empire and become superbly educated. They became so inventive that they came up with a quarter of all major inventions in the world, the most important of which was the invention of ships that could travel around the world to collect great riches, and the invention of capitalism, as we know it today, to finance those voyages. They, like all leading empires, enhanced their thinking by being open to the best thinking in the world. As a result, the people in the country become more productive and more competitive in world markets, which shows up in their growing economic output and rising share of world trade. You can see this happening now as the U.S. and China are roughly comparable in both their economic outputs and their shares of world trade. As countries trade more globally, they must protect their trade routes and their foreign interests from attack, so they develop great military strength. If done well, this virtuous cycle leads to strong income growth, which can be used to finance investments in education, infrastructure, and research and development. They must also develop systems to incentivize and empower those that have the ability to make or take wealth. In all of these cases, the most successful empires used a capitalist approach to develop productive entrepreneurs. Even China, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party, used a form of this capitalist approach. Deng Xiaoping, when asked about this, said, "It doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as it catches mice. And it's glorious to be rich." To do this well, they must develop their capital markets. Most importantly, their lending, bond, and stock markets. That allows people to convert their savings into investments to fund invention and development, and share in the successes of those who make great things happen. The Dutch created the first publicly listed company, the Dutch East India Company, and the first stock market to fund it, which were integral parts of the system that produced massive wealth and power. As a natural consequence, the greatest empires developed the world's leading financial centers for attracting and distributing the world's capital. Amsterdam was the world's financial center when the Dutch were preeminent. London, when the British were on top. New York is now. And China is quickly developing its financial centers. Most importantly, the capitalists, the governments, and the military must work together. Not only did the Dutch work well together, they were one and the same. The Dutch East India Company was granted a trade monopoly from the government and had its own officially sanctioned military to go out into the global markets to make and take wealth. The British followed with the British East India Company and had a similar coordination of their government, business, and military operations. The U.S. military-industrial complex followed suit, as does the Chinese system today. As the country becomes the largest international trading empire, its transactions can be paid with its currency, making it the preferred global medium of exchange. And because their currency is so widely accepted and frequently used, people around the world want to save in it, making it the preferred storehold of wealth, and thus the world's leading reserve currency. The guilder was the world's main reserve currency when the Dutch led world trade, the pound was when the British led, and the dollar has been since the US led. Naturally, China's currency is increasingly being used as a reserve currency. Having a reserve currency enables the empire to borrow more than other countries. That advantage is huge. Think about it. People all over the world are eager to save and hence lend back their currency to the empire. Countries without a reserve currency don't have that. And when the empire runs out of its own money, remember the United States in 1971? They can always print more. The exorbitant privilege afforded by the empire's reserve currency leads borrowing to increase and the beginning of a financial bubble. This series of cause and effect relationships leading to mutually supportive financial, political, and military powers, bolstered by the borrowing power of a reserve currency, have gone together since history began to be recorded. All the empires that became the most powerful in the world followed this path to the top. While in the top phase, most of these strengths are sustained, embedded within the fruits of their success are the seeds of their decline. As a rule, as people in these rich and powerful countries earn more, that makes them more expensive and less competitive relative to people in other countries who are willing to work for less. At the same time, people in other countries naturally copy the methods and technologies of the leading power, which further reduces the leading power's competitiveness. For example, British shipbuilders had less expensive workers than Dutch shipbuilders. So they hired Dutch designers to design better ships that were built by less expensive British workers, making them more competitive, which led the British to rise and the Dutch to decline. Also, as people become richer, they tend not to work as hard. They enjoy more leisure, pursue the finer and less productive things in life, and at the extreme become decadent. Values change from generation to generation during the rise to the top, from those who had to fight to achieve wealth and power to those who inherited it. They're less battle-hardened, steeped in luxuries, and accustomed to the easy life, which makes them more vulnerable to challenges. The golden era of the Dutch Empire and the Victorian era of the British Empire were such high prosperity periods like this. As people get used to doing well, they increasingly bet on the good times continuing and borrow money to do that, which grows into financial bubbles. Naturally, the financial gains come unevenly, so the wealth gap grows. Wealth gaps are self-reinforcing because rich people use their greater resources to reinforce their powers. For example, they give greater privileges to their children, like better education, and they influence the political system to their advantage. This causes the gaps in values, politics, and opportunities to grow between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Those who are less well off feel the system is unfair, so resentments grow. But as long as the living standards of most people are still rising, these gaps and resentments don't boil over into conflict. Having the world's reserve currency inevitably leads to borrowing excessively and contributes to the country building up large debts with foreign lenders. While this boosts spending power over the short term, it weakens the country's financial health and weakens the currency over the long term. In other words, when borrowing and spending are strong, the empire appears very strong, but its finances are in fact being weakened. The borrowing sustains the country's power beyond its fundamentals by financing both domestic overconsumption and international military conflicts required to maintain the empire. Inevitably, the cost of maintaining and defending the empire becomes greater than the revenue it brings in, so having an empire becomes unprofitable. For example, the Dutch Empire overextended around the world and fought war after increasingly expensive war with the British and other European powers to protect its territory and trade routes. The British Empire similarly became massive, bureaucratic, and lost its competitive advantages as rival powers, particularly Germany, soared, leading to an increasingly expensive arms race and World War. The U.S. has spent about $8 trillion on foreign wars and their consequences since September 11, and trillions more for other military operations and for supporting military bases in 70 countries. And it still isn't spending enough to support its military competition with China in the area around China. In this cycle, the richer countries eventually get deeper into debt by borrowing from poorer countries that save more. It's one of the early signs of a wealth and power shift. This started in the United States in the 1980s when it had a per capita income 40 times that of China's and started borrowing from Chinese who wanted to save in dollars because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. Similarly, the British borrowed a lot of money from its much poorer colonies, and the Dutch did the same at their time. If the empire begins to run out of new lenders, those holding their currency begin to look to sell and get out rather than to buy, save, lend, and get in. And the strength of the empire begins to decline. The decline. The decline comes from internal economic weakness together with internal fighting or costly external fighting or both. Typically, the decline comes gradually and then very suddenly. When debts become very large and there is an economic downturn and the empire can no longer borrow the money necessary to repay its debts, the financial bubble bursts. This creates great domestic hardships and forces the country to choose between defaulting on its debts or printing a lot of new money. It always chooses to print a lot of new money, at first gradually and eventually massively. That devalues the currency and raises inflation. For the Dutch, this was the financial crisis brought about by financial excesses and paying for the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Similarly, for the British, it was paying for its financial excesses and its debts from the two world wars. And for the U.S., it's been 3 cycles of debt finance booms and busts since the 90s, with the central bank stepping in each time with stronger measures. When the government has problems funding itself, when there are bad economic conditions, and living standards for most people are declining, and there are large wealth, values, and political gaps, internal conflict between the rich and the poor, as well as different ethnic, religious, and racial groups, greatly increases. This leads to political extremism that shows up as populism of the left or the right. Those of the left seek to redistribute the wealth, while those of the right seek to maintain the wealth in the hands of the rich. Typically, during such times, taxes on the rich rise, and when the rich fear their wealth and well-being will be taken away, they move to places, assets, and currencies they feel safer in. These outflows reduce the empire's tax revenue, which leads to a classic, self-reinforcing, hollowing out process. When the flight of wealth gets bad enough, governments outlaw it. Those seeking to get out begin to panic. These turbulent conditions undermine productivity, which shrinks the economic pie and causes more conflict about how to divide the shrinking resources. Populist leaders emerge from both sides and pledge to take control and bring about order. That's when democracy is most challenged because it fails to control the anarchy. and it is when the move to a strong populist leader who will bring order to the chaos is most likely. As conflict within the country escalates, it leads to some form of revolution or civil war to redistribute wealth and force the necessary big changes. This can be peaceful and maintain the existing order, but it's more often violent and changes the order. For example, the Roosevelt Revolution to redistribute wealth was relatively peaceful and maintained the existing internal order, while the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution were much more violent and led to new internal orders. This internal conflict makes the empire weak and vulnerable to rising external rivals who, seeing this domestic weakness, are more inclined to mount a challenge. This raises the risk of great international conflict, especially if the rival has built up a comparable military. Defending oneself and one's empire against rivals requires great military spending, which has to occur as domestic economic conditions are deteriorating and the empire can least afford it. Since there is no viable system for peacefully adjudicating international disputes, these conflicts are typically resolved through tests of power. As bolder challenges are made, the leading empire is faced with the difficult choice of fighting or retreating. Fighting and losing is the worst outcome, but retreating is bad too, as it cedes progress to the rival and signals that the empire is weak to those countries that are considering which side to be on. Poor economic conditions cause more fighting for wealth and power, which inevitably leads to some kind of war. Wars are terribly costly. At the same time, they produce the tectonic shifts that realign the new orders to the new realities of wealth and power in the world. When those holding the reserve currency and debt of the declining empire lose faith and sell them, that marks the end of its big cycle. Of the roughly 750 currencies that existed since 1700, less than 20% now exist, and all of them have been devalued. For the Dutch, this happened after their defeat in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, when they weren't able to repay the massive debts they built up during it. This led to a run on the Bank of Amsterdam and a desperate sell-off, forcing massive money printing, which devalued the currency and the empire into irrelevance. For the British, this happened after World War II, when despite their victory, they could not repay the massive debts they borrowed to fund their war effort. This led to a series of money printing, devaluations, and sell-offs in the British pound as the US and the dollar emerged dominant and created a new world order. At the time of this recording, the United States hasn't yet reached this point. While it has massive debt, spends more than it earns, and funds this deficit with more borrowing and printing huge amounts of new money, the big sell-off in dollars and dollar debt hasn't yet begun. And while there are great internal and external conflicts occurring for all the classic reasons, they've not yet crossed the line to become wars. Eventually, out of these conflicts, whether they're violent or not, come new winners who get together and restructure the losers' debts and political systems and establish the new world order. Then the old cycle and empire ends and the new one begins, and they do it all over again. That's a lot of detail I just threw at you to paint a picture of how the typical big cycle transpires. Of course, not all of them transpire in exactly this way, but most largely do. So much so that it seems like the stories of rises and declines stay essentially the same, and the only things that change are the clothes the characters wear and the technologies they use. So, where are we heading? The future. Most empires have their time in the sun and inevitably decline. Reversing a decline is difficult because that requires undoing a lot that's already been done, but it's possible. By looking at these indicators, it's pretty easy to see which stage of the big cycle an empire is in, how fit it is, and whether its condition is improving or worsening, which can help one estimate how many years it has left. Still, these estimates aren't precise, and the cycle can be extended if those in charge pay attention to their vital signs and improve them. For example, knowing that a person is 60 years old, how fit they are, whether they smoke or not, and a few other basic vital signs, one can estimate the person's longevity. One can do that with empires and their vital signs too. It won't be precise, but it will be broadly indicative and give clear direction on steps to take to increase longevity. It's most often the case that a nation's greatest war is with itself over whether or not it can make the hard decisions needed to sustain success. As for what we need to do, it comes down to just two things: earn more than we spend and treat each other well. All other things I mentioned, strong education, inventiveness, being competitive, and all the rest, are just ways of getting at these two things. It's easy to measure if we're doing them. So like people who want to get fit, let's get on the program and improve our vitals. Let's do that individually and collectively. My goal for sharing this picture of how the world works and a few principles for dealing with it well is to help you recognize where we are and the challenges we face, and to make the wise decisions needed to navigate these times well. Since there is a lot more to discuss and we are out of time, you can learn more in my book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, and I look forward to continuing this conversation at economicprinciples.org and on social media. Thank you, and may the force of evolution be with you.
In this lecture, we're going to be discussing what's perhaps the most significant thing a company can do, and that's to maximize cash flow. While it's traditional to say that the bottom line is what matters, that is profits, none of us can be paid in profits. We have to be paid in cash. And so while profits are a nice thing to report if you're on a bonus system, the reality is it's cash that's king. We're now therefore going to turn our attention to the idea of cash flows. Many companies have finally discovered this, and it's become quite an issue, and I'll talk about it a little later. Cash flow is calculated simply on your screen by adding back to the profit after tax the non-cash expenses that we incurred in generating those profits. Certain costs that we deducted from the income statement in order to reduce our reportable income and hence our taxes were not actually cash expenses. We didn't reach in our pocket and spend that money. A good example is depreciation. The money was spent on equipment when we bought it. The depreciation charge is just our way of attempting to recoup the cost of the equipment by writing it off and saving a little bit in taxes each year by the write-off of the depreciation expense. So cash flow would include not only profit, but it should certainly also include the depreciation charge, which was not a cash expense. Amortization of goodwill, amortization of patents, amortization of copyrights are also non-cash expenses. Those costs were incurred when we invested in those assets, and we're simply trying to find a way to recoup them. All of these then represent attempts to increase cash flow. So that, for example, if we looked at the XYZ company, or example again, we noticed that the profit after tax that they reported in 1995 amounted to some $14 million. To get to how much cash flow they generated, we would add back the non-cash expenses. The only obvious one in the income statement of XYZ is the depreciation charge of some $7,000. So in reality, XYZ generated $21,000 of cash. And cash is what you can use to spend to pay wages and do other nice things, including buying other companies. You can even pay dividends out of cash flow. So cash is king, and we're going to pay a lot of attention to that. The reason it's become so important is that many companies find that because they don't manage cash flow, they end up not managing their assets properly. One idea that we might spend a moment with is the concept of working capital. Working capital is simply defined as the difference between current assets and current liabilities. That is, how much money, short term, do we have to put up in order to run the business? Remember that we'll assume that all the fixed assets can be financed with either debt or equity. But somehow or another, we have to come up with some money to run the business with, to finance the inventories, to finance the receivables, to run the cash. Part of that is offset by the fact that we can borrow from you, managers, who are willing to loan us your wages or salaries for a while. We can borrow from our suppliers in the form of accounts payable. Remember, we said we could borrow from the tax collector in the form of taxes payable. So a number of things help to reduce the amount of money we have to come up with for working capital. But the working capital calculation for XYZ, they had current assets of $25 million and current liabilities of some $14 million. And so they had to produce somehow $11 million of cash to operate the business, either by additional borrowing or some other means, equity being the other principal means. The management of cash flow has become, and working capital has become a major issue in companies. Tying up money in working capital is an expensive process that in itself doesn't earn money. You have to do it because indeed you have to finance sales, indeed you have to carry inventories, indeed you need cash around, and in some cases you have to prepay expenses, offset admittedly by current liabilities, but all the difference we've got to finance. And so companies are now beginning to charge their subsidiaries for the use of working capital. Just to remind you managers that working capital matters and you're going to have to pay for it. One company that I consult to charges its managers 12% for the use of working capital. That comes out of the division's bottom line and reduces the amount of bonus that you earn if you use too much working capital. So a lot of energy is being used to try to figure out what to do to improve working capital and hence also cash flows. What can you do? Well, among other things, collect your receivables faster. Don't carry excessive inventories. But remember, the question that we dealt with each time was, does it matter to anybody? And the answer is, of course, it depends. If we cut inventories, yes, that reduces our working capital requirement because current assets have gone down when we cut inventory. But on the other hand, if we cut inventories, our customers aren't very happy with us because we're not as reliable a supplier, especially a just-in-time supplier. We could cut receivables, that is, make them pay faster. But of course, customers don't want to pay any faster. So there's a push and pull in all of these things, and we don't want to alienate the customers. In fact, you can bet that the sales managers in the audience will be very much against reducing the collection time because that makes it harder to sell. The competitors are offering better terms than we are. Finally, you might pay your payables slower. That's one way to increase the current liability item and hence reduce the amount of money we need for working capital. I think I've already alluded to, but one way to pay slower is to make sure that we don't pay for anything until it's perfect, which means we have to have a serious review. We have to look with pride and view with alarm at everything that comes in the door. We have to consider whether it's all there, whether it meets specs. If any one of the items is bad, we don't pay for anything until they're all paid for. And remember, we only write checks on Friday afternoon so that we get additional grace period on the postage. So all of these things are meant to increase, or rather decrease, the amount of working capital used, because that frees up cash for other uses, and that's part of cash flow too. The use of cash that's available because we freed it out of other assets where it wasn't as productive as it should be. Now, how do we know how much we should have in working capital? Well, there's several approaches. The basic one is benchmarking. What do we look like compared to competitors? And it's an interesting exercise to try to figure out which competitor we ought to compare ourselves to. Better yet, which competitors should we compare ourselves to? From a middle manager's viewpoint, this is tough business because we might decide that there are 5 companies to which it would be logical to compare our business. And we could take the average of their figures and see what kind of working capital requirements they have to support their sales and say that's what we ought to do. But of course, the general manager of the business, the president, would probably say, now wait a minute, we ought to do as well as the best. So then we take a look at the 5 and see who did best, and we're supposed to do at least as well as the best guy. That wouldn't be too bad if he told us we had to do as well as the best guy on the overall figure working capital. But how about if we had a separate benchmark for days of receivables, amount of money tied up in cash, days of inventories, and days of payables, and we had to meet the best criteria on each of them? Well, that's like walking on water. And of course, that's all we expect of you middle managers. And the senior manager's job is to crack the whip to see that you do it. There are other non-cash expenses that I think I should mention. Remember that depletion is also a non-cash expense. It's just a tax vagary. Now, there's some other things that will affect cash flow that we have to look at. We sort of talked about it before, but now we have to talk about it in more detail. Remember that in the first session we talked about how we maintain inventory valuations on either a Lifo or a Fifo basis, last in, first out, or first in, first out. And we discovered that the principal advantage in using Lifo is that it reduces our taxable income because we're selling the most recently acquired inventory, which was acquired due to inflation at much higher prices, so we report less income to the tax collector and pay less taxes. On the other hand, we decided we'd report FIFO, first in, first out, to our shareholders because that would make them feel good about what a great profit we're generating. Well, in addition to affecting profit, the choice affects cash flow. Let's see if we can illustrate that. The year is 1491, a period of very high inflation, I must tell you. Columbus hasn't yet sailed, and they haven't discovered gold in the New World. We've decided to open a shoe store. You know what shoes look like in 1491? They all curled up in the front, and they all looked alike, and they were all the same size. If you wanted to make them fit, you just stuff something in with your stocking. We decided to open a shoe store, and we're going to need 3 pairs of shoes in inventory in order to open the store. So we go out and we acquire our first pair of shoes, and we pay 100 shekels for them, or whatever the unit of currency was in the country we're in. The next day we buy a second pair of shoes, and we pay 120 shekels due to inflation. And on the third day, we buy still a third pair and pay 140 shekels. So we now have a 360 shekel investment in inventory. We can't tell one pair of shoes from another. All we know is that there are 3 pairs of shoes that on average cost us about 120 shekels a pair. Now let's see what the use of a particular evaluation system for inventories would do to our results. A customer comes in and we decide we're going to sell shoes for 200 shekels per pair. And so we make a sale of a pair of shoes for 200 shekels. In order to calculate the profit, we have to decide what the pair of shoes that we sold cost us. What did it cost us? Well, if we use a Lifo system, last in, first out, then the pair of shoes we sold was the most recently acquired pair, the expensive pair, at 140 shekels a pair. So the cost of goods sold was 140 shekels, and we will have a pre-tax profit, profit before tax, of 60 shekels. Now, there may be other expenses, but let's keep it simple. We're selling at a roadside stand, so we have no rent or anything. and it's a mom and pop operation, so we'll just call profit our own salary, although we could easily take a salary out of this business if we wanted to. The tax collector, of course, wants his bite. Taxes are at 50%, pretty steep in this country. So taxes are 50% of our pre-tax profits, or 30 shekels, and therefore we have a profit after tax of 30 shekels. Now let's see what would have happened had we elected to go on a Fifo basis, first in, first out. In that case, when we sold the shoes for 200 shekels a pair under Fifo, the cost of goods sold would be the cost of the first pair of shoes we bought, the first in, which was 100 shekels a pair. And so we would have to admit to a profit before tax of 100 shekels. The tax collector, as usual, wants 50% of the pre-tax profit, so we give 50 shekels to the tax collector and report that we made a 50 shekel pre-tax profit. Now, if we were a salaried employee or an employee working on bonus, I think it's clear that the FIFO system would make us look like more of a hero than the Lifo system, because we could report 50 shekels of profit instead of 30 shekels, and our bonus should therefore be bigger. On the other hand, if, as you, as I do, believe that Ben Franklin was right and it's our patriotic duty to minimize taxes, clearly the Lifo system is superior because we only paid 30 shekels here where we paid 50 shekels under this system. However, beyond the impact on profit, there's also the impact on cash. But let's see what the cash position of the company was after making this transaction. Notice that under the Lifo system, 200 shekels came in, and we gave 30 of it to the tax collector, and so we must be left with 170 shekels of cash. We're under the Fifo system, 200 shekels came in, and we gave 50 of it to the tax collector, so we're left with 150 shekels of cash. Well, if inflation were to continue, the next pair of shoes might cost us 160 shekels. We wouldn't even have enough cash to replace the inventory we sold under the Fifo system. We're under the Lifo system. We could replace the inventory item we sold. It would cost us 160 to do it, and still have 10 shekels left to pay the bonus that we're after. So from the standpoint of cash flows, cash in hand at the end of the day, Lifo clearly gave us a better result. We ended up with more cash in hand because we managed to find a way to pay less taxes. So in addition to impacting profit, notice that the two systems impact cash flows differently. Now, I didn't mention it, but obviously we could have used average, in which case the average number would have been 120, and the result would have been something between these two, and so it's of no great interest, but some companies do use average inventory valuations. The other impact that we discovered we could make on profit due to the system we elected was the impact we could have on depreciation. If we used accelerated depreciation, we decided that might indeed reduce our taxable income. Let's see what impact it also has on cash flow. Let's take a very simple example. A company buys a machine for $100. If you like big numbers, put extra zeros after it. Everything, $100 for the machine. We think it has a 10-year life, and let's suppose we figure it has no salvage value, so we're going to write off the full $100 in 10 years. One way to do it is to charge off $10 each year, straight line depreciation, a $10 charge each year. Another possibility is to find some way of accelerating depreciation, that is, to charge more in some years and less in other years. One technique is called the sum of the year's digits. All you do is take the number of years, 10, add up 10 plus 9, that's 19, and 8 is 27, and 7 is 34, and 6 is 40, and 5 is 45, and 4 is 49, and 3 is 52, and so on down, and get a total sum of those numbers, and then take, for the first year, 10 55ths, which is what it comes to, 10 55ths of the total value in depreciation, something better than, or approaching 20%, even though under the straight line basis, we'd only take 10% the first year. Then the second year, we'd take 9 55ths and so on down. Well, then we could use accelerated depreciation, and I'll just make up some depreciation figures just to show you what might happen. Let's suppose that back in the example with the shoe business, we were actually making the shoes, and we had some shoemaker equipment we were depreciating. So that when we got to this point before we calculated pre-tax profit, we'd have to insert an item called depreciation. Well, can you see that if we use accelerated depreciation, we'll get to charge off a greater amount in the first years, resulting in a still lower taxable income, resulting in a still lower tax, but of course also resulting in a still lower profit after tax. But in terms of cash flow, since depreciation is not a cash charge, that we didn't spend any money on depreciation, we're simply charging it off so that we can pay the tax collector less. It's still a situation where 200 came in and the only thing we handed out was 30 shekels. However, it wouldn't even be 30 shekels because with depreciation, particularly accelerated depreciation, we'd have less to pay the tax collector. Let's suppose our depreciation charge in this case was 20 and in this case 10. Now the profit before tax would be reduced down to 40. The tax collector gets 20 and we're left with $20 of pre-tax profits. In this situation where we charge 10 shekels for depreciation, the profit now comes down to 90. We give 45 of it to the tax collector, and we're left with 45 after tax. But in terms of cash flows, we're still better off under the accelerated depreciation thing because we really never spent that money. We just used it as a way to defer taxes. Now remember, that's going to catch up with us. It will catch up with us in later years when we don't have much of a write-off. In the very last year, we only get to write off 1/55th under the sum of the year's digits of the value of that machine. So the attractive part about using accelerated depreciation is that it improves cash flows up front, but the price you pay is that cash flows in later years will be diminished. We still have another interesting problem to face given our LIFO inventory valuation system. And that is, what happens if we have a really good year and don't sell one pair of shoes but sell 2 pairs of shoes? Well, can you see if we do that, we would have 400 shekels coming in. We're selling 2 pairs of shoes. But, and this is the big but, not only are we selling the 140 shekel pair, but now we're beginning to reach back into the inventory and sell cheaper shoes. So the total cost of goods sold is not 140, but 260. And therefore our profit margins begin to improve, and we begin to have to pay higher taxes because we're admitting that we're selling some of that older, lower valued inventory. This is called a Lifo liquidation. When we begin to reach back and liquidate inventory that was carried on a Lifo, a last in, first in, out basis, we begin to reach back in the stack and sell that cheap stuff, and the result is we're going to report hellacious profits and pay the tax that goes with it. So if we ever liquidate inventory, if we're on a LIFO system, it's going to catch up with us. Now, in the normal course of business, if we replace inventory as fast as we sell it, we won't run into that because we'll always be selling the most recent pair of shoes. Always the last ones in are the first ones out. But if we ever get out of that business or deliberately allow our stock level to fall in this particular stock item, then indeed we will have to report greater profits and pay the tax collector. That wouldn't please Ben, but of course it might please the boss and the shareholders because we'd be reporting better profits. So cash flow is influenced by the choice of the valuation system on inventory, and it's influenced by the choice of the depreciation schedule, accelerated versus straight line depreciation. Not just profit, but also cash flow. Each organization, besides preparing the statements that I showed you for XYZ in terms of income statement and consolidated balance sheet, will normally also include a cash flow statement. And they'll start with, here are our profits, and then they begin to add back the non-cash expenses to get to cash flow. And then they tell you what they do with the cash in the same statement. We might have used some of it to invest in more inventory. We might have used some of it to buy some machines. We might use some of it to pay off some debt. All sorts of uses cash can be put to. On the other hand, we might have also freed up some cash. Maybe we got rid of a couple excess automobiles and got the value out of those cars. That's an accretion or an increase in cash. So the cash flow statement simply not only explains what the cash flows were, but sort of what we did with the cash. And down at the bottom line of the cash flow statement, that bottom number better tell you what happened to the cash account for the year, because that's what it purports to say. These were the cash items coming in, these were the cash items going out, and therefore the bottom line is the change in cash. And so we better be able to explain how cash changed from 94 to 95 by looking at the cash flow statement. In some cases, it's more interesting than the income statement and the balance sheet, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we want to deal with today. But remember, cash is king. And the management of working capital, which is part of the way we invest cash, has become a very critical issue with management because there is a cost to working capital. We do have to pay for the use of that money, and it's not necessarily the most productive assets we can have. How do you tell the troops that you want them to pay attention to it? You charge them for it and take it out of the bottom line of the division operations. Now, there are other things that influence the performance of the business that we started to touch upon when we talked about the nature of fixed and variable costs. Remember, we said that the name of the game was to keep the plant as busy as possible. In fact, we would stretch to do that and perhaps even sell widgets as cheap as 601, a penny more than variable cost, if that's what it took to sell more widgets. And we discovered that when you have this operating leverage that's forcing you to do this, that the attraction of making more sales is that profits seem to rise faster than sales because of the leverage of fixed cost. It might be interesting to look at that again, this time in light of the actual cost per unit. The screen that you're looking at now shows you the total unit cost to produce a widget, which is simply the unit variable cost. That's, remember, raw material, direct labor, energy used in the production process, and perhaps the commission we pay to salespeople, if they're on commission, plus the share of the fixed cost that each unit is asked to bear. And the way we'll share the fixed cost is to simply take the total fixed cost and divide it by the volume produced. So the more volume we produce, the more we can spread the fixed cost, and therefore the lower the total unit cost that we incur. And that helps to explain further why profits ought to go up percentage-wise faster than sales. Can you see that not only are we selling more units, but apparently the cost is going to come down because we're going to spread fixed costs over more units, and therefore each unit is going to cost less to produce. In the original example, when we went back and said we had $6 of variable cost and we had $20,000 of fixed cost, and we were spreading it over 10,000 units, the total unit cost to produce each unit was $8 per unit. 6 of variable costs and a $2 share of the overhead or fixed cost that we had as a company that had to be borne by each widget we sold. But when volume went up to 11,000 units, we still had $6 of variable cost, but now the $20,000 of fixed cost is being spread over 11,000 units, and the total unit cost I leave you to calculate is clearly going to be less than $8 a unit. So not only are we selling more units, but we're selling them units that cost us less to make per unit. And that may explain, in fact does, why profits go up faster than sales do when there's an item of fixed cost. More sales and a lower unit cost, total cost, because we're spreading fixed cost. The combination gives us what we call leverage. That leverage is financial, you'll remember, if the fixed costs are financial costs like interest. It's operating leverage if the fixed costs are fixed costs like depreciation. Ordinarily, it's a combination of the two. Remember that when we went down to 9,000 units, we'd have to spread the $20,000 not over 11,000 units, but over 9,000 units, and that's something over $2.20 a unit, so the cost would go up to $8.80, where down here it was down to probably about $7.80. So when we drop in volume, not only are we selling fewer units, but each unit's costing us more to make. So clearly profits are going to drop. So the name of the game when you have fixed costs is keep the thing busy no matter what. Well, not quite no matter what. No matter what, as long as we can realize at least variable cost from the sale of the unit. If we can achieve variable cost and a little bit more, we're better off to stay busy. Now, economists like to talk about economies of scale. In reality, all that an economy of scale really is working the plant hard enough to spread the fixed cost over the maximum number of units possible. If the plant stays busy enough, We spread the fixed cost over more units, and the average unit cost comes down, and the economists are very happy and talk about economies of scale. Simply keeping busy so that you can spread the fixed costs. However, there are some other things about scale that are important from a managerial viewpoint, and those are worth discussing, and that is, how big should a plant be? We'll discover in a later session that these numbers get to be very important when you begin to scale up and build bigger plants. But how should a plant be? How big should it be? Well, a good example is a petroleum refinery. When you make petroleum, like it or not, you produce other products. Typically, when you produce petroleum, you produce gasoline, heating oil, and kerosene used as fuel in jet engines. And so we take a crude oil feedstock and we put it through some kind of refining process, and we get these three products. Unfortunately, at the same time, we always get some byproducts. I'll just show one in this case. Let's call it byproduct A. Now, the least efficient use one can put a byproduct to is to burn it as energy. Much better use is to make plastic or some valuable material out of it. So it would be very desirable, in order to make this whole refining operation economic, to find an application for product A. Now, we might do it ourselves, but better yet, suppose we could convince someone else to build a plant that would use byproduct A as the feedstock for his plant. Well, okay, so we'll build a second plant using byproduct A as a feedstock, and this fellow will be producing a couple products. Let's call them product 1 and product 2, and incidentally, although he doesn't want to, he'll produce some additional byproducts. I'll show it as byproduct B. Now, he's faced with the same dilemma that we are. That is, he'd like to see an efficient use for B rather than burning it. And so there's no doubt that he'd like to find somebody to use byproduct B as a feedstock for his process. Unfortunately, this guy wants a big enough plant to make it worthwhile, which means he needs a lot of this byproduct B to operate the plant. Well, that means that our principal customer wants to build a bigger plant and produce more of 1 and 2, and incidentally, therefore, more of byproduct B. But if he wants a bigger plant, he needs more feedstock, which means we need a bigger plant to produce enough of byproduct A to run the whole operation. And this is why petroleum refineries tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger. An alternative is to co-locate several petroleum plants so that we have several byproduct A's, that all of which can feed into this guy's plant to make it economic. But world-scale petroleum plants, by their nature, have to be very large in order to get efficient use of byproducts. There are other analogies for this. For example, when you produce copper, you produce sulfur as part of the refining process. Again, if you want to find an economic use for sulfur, you have to build the refinery for the copper on a very large scale. There's a lot of other arguments for building on a big scale. For example, in a paper mill, the Fourdrinier machines, the large paper-making machines, typically you'll see 2 or 3 of them running in parallel. The reason for this is that the most expensive labor in the plant are the mechanics who keep the machines running and who set up the machines for the next run. If you only had a single Fourdrinier machine in the plant, most of the time these expensive mechanics would be sitting around with their hands in their pocket. A fixed cost, if you would, because the mechanics are on salary, that's not being utilized. And we know the name of the game is to keep fixed costs busy. Well, one way to keep the mechanics busy is to have more machines for them to worry about. So typically in a paper mill, you'll see 2 or 3 machines in parallel. The same thing applies to a steel mill. You'll see several rolling mills running in parallel. There are additional arguments for making plants big. The individual machines that are running in parallel might need some very heavy and very expensive support equipment, perhaps cranes to lift the rolls of paper that go into the machines, in the case of the paper mill. Well, perhaps we don't need a crane for each of the machines, but we could have one big crane that could serve all 3 machines in turn. Similarly, the machine that makes the pulp that gets poured onto these machines, one large machine might be able to serve 3 paper-making machines. And so the combinations of what are the efficient sizes for different parts so that you get full utilization sort of dictate that you operate on a large scale. In a later lecture, we'll discover that there are some specific economics that say build the plant big. Now, it should also be obvious to you that there are some limitations in how big you want to build, if nothing else, because if you had a fire, it would be a real catastrophe. At this point, I'd like to introduce the materials that we're going to be talking about in the next lecture, because I think it will be of particular interest to you to do some preparation for the next lecture so that you'll be comfortable when we begin to look at the U.S. Steel Annual Report. We're going to be going back and forth in that report and discovering a lot of ideas, and in order to do that, it'll be much better if you're already familiar with it. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what it means to make steel, and also to give you a few questions that you might want to think about before you turn into the next lecture. U.S. Steel is the largest steel company in the United States, and at the time we were interested in it, it clearly was the largest steel company in the world. This was 1972. I chose the U.S. Steel Annual Report because years ago a friend and I, a colleague, did some work on this, and this is a model of full disclosure. There probably isn't a better report in the world in terms of telling the shareholders exactly what was going on. Very few firms go to the bother of telling people quite as much information as U.S. Steel does. We're going to be looking at it as a way of summary of all the things we've been doing and talking about as we've looked at annual reports and looked at financial statements. We'll be looking, as I mentioned, at the U.S. Steel Annual Report for 1972. Now, steel companies operate on a very large scale for some of the reasons I just mentioned. Efficient use of the supporting equipment, better use of the mechanics, greater use of different kinds of materials so they can produce more than one product at a time. All sorts of arguments suggest that steel companies should operate as capital-intensive, very large facilities. Steel is produced by combining coke, that's coal with some of the garbage taken out of it, limestone, and iron ore. Very large quantities of these materials, which are of low bulk value and therefore relatively expensive to move around, have to be assembled at a steel mill in order to make steel. Interestingly, when I was a student, a colleague of mine actually produced a model that could locate all the steel mills in the United States. What he did was to take a large map of the United States and spread it out on a table. And every place where one of the raw material sources was available, that's the coke, coal, limestone, and iron ore, he drilled a hole through the table, through the map. He put a string down through the hole and attached a weight on the bottom that was in proportion to the cost of moving that kind of material around. Then he pulled the three strings together and tied them and let them find their own center with the weights pulling on the strings. And he could locate every steel mill in the United States within about 3 miles. Now, the only thing it didn't do is to take into account you also want to be on a waterway for several reasons. Steel making requires a lot of water, and secondly, moving by water is a cheap way to do things. In fact, we'll discuss this in a later lecture. And so locating on a river makes good sense. But he found Pittsburgh and he found Chicago and every other location. And somebody else duplicated it using springs instead of weights one time. But I thought it was a pretty clever analogy. In any event, you can locate steel mills, and basically they're located to minimize the cost of assembling these three raw materials because it is expensive to bring them together. Basically, you sort of bake them together. The limestone provides something to take the garbage off with, and you pour it off as slag. And what you're left with is relatively pure iron, which we call pig iron. Hopefully, we get as much carbon as possible out of it, and then we put a tiny bit of carbon back in it while it's still melted, and that makes it steel. We can also add alloying agents like molybdenum and chromium and other things, which make it much fancier, stronger, gives it other properties like stainless. So basically, this is the steel-making business. Steel, of course, it's argued we're in the steel age. Everything that matters that we deal with has steel in it. We talked about the Honda earlier in another session, and you realize that 90% of the weight of a Honda is steel. And if the thing doesn't fly, the chances are that 90% of the weight of almost anything is steel. So this is the steel age, and everybody uses it, but what that means is that steel effectively is tied to the economy and therefore is a cyclical industry. That is, because the economy goes up and down, if nothing else because the Fed keeps messing around with interest rates, then the sales of steel go up and down. Everybody who uses steel needs it, and he needs it when they want it. They don't want it lying around because there's a lot of it. And so they want just-in-time deliveries, but to ensure just-in-time deliveries, you have to order steel well in advance. In fact, typically 18 months in advance was not unusual in this period. I should warn you that in the years since, the steel business has changed substantially. We now have what we call mini mills that are very responsive and can give you materials in the shape you wanted on 10 days' notice if you really need it. But back in this period, the large auto companies and other people who use large amounts of steel would typically begin to place orders a year and a half in advance. Now that was important to U.S. Steel because it meant their sales forecast could take into account that they knew not only what we were going to do this year, but had a pretty good idea what kind of year the next year was going to be. Needless to say, the deliveries had to be on time because if you were running an auto plant and the steel didn't arrive, you're out of action. And the auto plants don't want to stock materials. The analogy to the oil business is kind of interesting. When you build these large refineries, you protect yourself against stockouts by having huge quantities of raw material at the front end of the plant. Just in case the tanker doesn't arrive with more crude oil, there's lots of tanks at the front end with crude oil already sitting there that you can revert to use to run the oil refinery. At the other end of the steel mill, we don't want to store the steel for any length of time, although steel takes weather pretty well, so we roll it up in a big roll and throw it out in the yard and let it sit. As long as it doesn't sit too long, it doesn't get rusty. In fact, if it's stainless, it won't get rusty anyway. Back to the analogy of the oil refinery, though, they have an additional problem. That is, the products they produce are seasonal. You use more gasoline in the summertime and more heating oil in the wintertime. Yet you're producing a constant mix of these products, and so it means you overproduce some products in the summer and you underproduce others, and vice versa in the winter. So the answer to that is they stock large quantities of material at the other end. Incidentally, if you were a spy up in a satellite, you can always spot an oil refinery because there's lots of white circles on the ground. That's the top of the storage tanks that are painted white to reflect the heat. So if you look down from a satellite and you see a lot of white circles, there's a refinery there somewhere. Well, the steel mill is a similar situation. What you see is a large yard, and incidentally, you tend to see a lot of smoke, although in recent years we've cleaned that up too. Well, here's the steel mill then, producing steel from raw materials that it just can't afford to stock, so they arrive on a continuous basis, and then producing a product that has to be delivered just in time at the other end. But at least they know what they need for the following years. Well, what questions should we be asking ourselves as we approach the U.S. Steel Annual Report? Remember, I told you in a previous session that the way you get information out of financial reports is to take a set of expectation to those reports. If you have an idea what ought to be there, then the difference between your expectations and the reality that you find is the important set of information. That's where you get ideas. With that in mind, I'd like to give you a few questions that you should work on and think about before you turn on the next lecture. The first one is just how well did U.S. Steel do in 1972? What did sales look like in 72 compared to 71? How much did they increase? Remember, I told you that not only do we want to take expectations to the annual report, we're very interested in changes. So the first question is, what percentage change occurred in sales for U.S. Steel in 1972 over 1971? The next question I'd like you to take into account is, what should that do for earnings? Now remember, we suggested that this is a capital-intensive business. Sales were up. What should happen to earnings? Should they go up the same percentage? Should they go up less? Should they go up more? And what, in fact, did happen? The next question is, given the results in earnings, what should happen to the dividend? If earnings were up, should the dividend increase? Should it remain the same? Should it decrease? If earnings were steady, what should happen to the dividend? And even more specifically, if earnings were to drop, what should happen to the dividend? The next question I'd like you to think about is, if you change the dividend, how does Wall Street react? What happens to the value of a stock if it changes its dividend, both up or down? The next question is, what was the effective tax rate that U.S. Steel paid in 1972 on its earnings? Now, some of you may not be old enough to remember, but taxes used to be even worse than they are now, if that's possible. And in fact, corporate taxes at that time were probably around 52 or 53% on income. What effective tax rate did U.S. Steel pay? Now, as you answer each of these questions, you'll probably want to leaf through the report. What we've done is to extract about 10 pages from the U.S. Steel Annual Report from 1972, which you'll find in your appendix. Leaf through the report and find out where these things are reported. A word of warning, the most interesting things are to be found not just on the income statement and balance sheet, but buried in the footnotes. Remember, the interesting things are always in the footnotes, and one word of warning, the most interesting things are always in the smallest letters. I think that's because Gottrocksbach here, the richest guy who owns all the stock, probably doesn't have good eyesight, and if we don't want to show him everything, the thing to do is to print it small. There's a couple other things you should know about annual reports, which unfortunately we're not able to show you here, but I'll show you a copy of the annual report when we get to it next session. Any time that the annual report is on slick paper and in color, earnings are up. You can say that with certainty. You don't even have to open the report. If earnings are down, the company will always produce it on plain paper in black and white, nowadays on recycled paper, although that wouldn't have been the case in '72, to show that they're economizing. So one of the lessons you'll learn when we look at the U.S. Steel Annual Report is to discover whether things are good before we even open the report. But remember, I told you that you want to take a set of expectations to the report, so indeed the ability to recognize that earnings are up or down just by looking at the front cover is a very useful one. You can always make a bet on it. Well, I wouldn't make bets on it. There are lessons to be learned from that. Somebody was telling me the other day that the surest way to know when to sell a stock is when the CEO's picture appears on the front of Time magazine with a favorable headline. Any time that the press gets around to saying somebody's good, it's already too late. And so the company usually dies the next year. So be careful about expectations, but at least in the case of the annual report, if it's got a slick cover, you're in pretty good shape. But of course, when you complete this course, I expect you to do more than look at just the first 2 pages of the report, which are always in pretty graphics, and usually have a letter from the president or the CEO congratulating himself and his company on the great job they did under the circumstances, and also telling you that he's very grateful to the employees for the good work they've done. So we're going to be looking at this report. Please get very familiar with it, because we're going to be leafing back and forth. You'll discover we've annotated the report, which will make it much easier for us to get to the particular things we're trying to get to. Good luck with your work.